within this broad sort of tapestry of individual experiences and everything you learnt and speaking to the participants within your research, I mean, where do you think the right place is to begin when we think about reasons why people start and then continue using methamphetamine?
At the core of this for a layperson would be, well, why do people even use methamphetamine? And perhaps they'll immediately go to some common kind of tropes like, well, they must be doing it to escape reality, or they're very damaged people and they need this to cope with life, or they're only doing it because they want to lose weight, or some ridiculous kind of popular culture narrative as to why that might be. I can't think of many off the top of my head, but they're not positive, right? But when we start looking at context and we start thinking about drug use in terms of stories, well, then we can see how people started this whole drug use journey. And this for me was probably one of the most important things in this research, right? That people's drug using journeys, if they are defined as a problematic drug user, and that's a problem with my research, it disproportionately focuses on problematic drug users. So what I mean by that is someone who might have experienced stereotypical understandings of addiction and engaged in some criminal behaviours because of their addiction. Their drug use is problematic. I make that distinction because there are some people who can use methamphetamine and have no problems. So we can look at them as a drug user who's not necessarily defined as being problematic. So there's that distinction. But when we look at people who end up in this kind of domain of problematic drug use, actually these people's lives around drugs started 10, 11, 12, they started using drugs. Invariably, the first drug of choice was alcohol, often. So you could say, well, this must be the most evil substance of all because look at where it leads to for some people. But we don't really think about alcohol as I hate the expression, as a gateway drug. That's a very flawed kind of way of understanding drug use. But for these people, for many of them, that was the thing that actually propelled them forwards on this journey of drug use. Sequential thinking about it, from alcohol, we had people go to cannabis. From cannabis, we had people use drugs they'd found in their parents' medical cabinets, drugs that they'd been prescribed for injuries. As they moved through that sequence of events, people accidentally discovered drugs by meeting a particular person in a particular time who happened to have substance X or substance Y, family members that they met later on in their lives who had substance X or substance Y. Generally for these people, they would have been something in the order of 10 to 20 different drug types before we got to methamphetamine use. So then we can see in our sequence of storying your drug use, well, hang on a minute, methamphetamine really wasn't the substance that set them into a lifetime of problematic drug use. That occurred many, many years ago. I'm not in any way downplaying how negative methamphetamine use is here, because certainly by the time they arrived to the substance, meth absolutely sped everything up at a rate of knots and caused significant harm. But in and of itself, that wasn't the substance that got them to where they were. They were on that journey a long time ago. So that idea of starting drug use was really core to this. And then more broadly, well, what do we think about? Well, how do we label drug users if we have to for research? Clearly, my sample were individuals who were polydrug users, and polydrug use is pretty normal amongst drug users generally. You know, you might go to a festival and you might have some ecstasy, but then you might have something else that you have before. Maybe you have something else afterwards to come down with in the afternoon and in the evening or whatever you're doing, right? So it's a fairly normal kind of approach to drug use. So that becomes very difficult to label this group of people as methamphetamine users when in fact they've got all of these other things going on in their lives. And all of that's discounted in policy. We're not even having conversations around that. How'd you get there to begin with? That's a useful starting point. And of course, every alcohol and drug clinician knows this already. Their insights would have been really useful in policy making, I imagine. Then we get to using, of course, and that's where things get really interesting. And I link using to the idea of risk environments, because then we're going, okay, so when you got to using methamphetamine, how did you navigate the risk around using this particular substance? Because I was interested in that. How could you engage in something that's been so stigmatized and vilified and publicly rejected, even by some smaller drug using communities? How could you get to that space? And that's where we get to this idea of risk environments, which are theorized by Rhodes, who'd done a lot of scholarship around HIV transmission and needle use. And Rhodes looked at why people engaged in risky behaviors when it came to intravenous drug use. And he started to point out a few things that made it more likely that people would engage in risk, and therefore more likely that they would be exposed to blood-borne diseases. For example, at a micro level, so we're thinking about personal relationships, those intravenous drug users would consider sharing needles with an intimate partner as something quite normal, because they're your partner, even though you're sharing blood by virtue of using these syringes, right? Sounds horrendous. But that's perfectly normal in the context of an intimate relationship when you're a problematic drug user. Then at a meso level, so then we're talking about sort of community and social setting level, that risk is further amplified, because you could look at a variable like gender and go, gender also exacerbates the likelihood that intravenous drug users may take risks, because gender can be used as a form of transaction in the nature of power, where women might feel they have to navigate power by exchanging sex for drugs and putting themselves in risky environments where they engage in intravenous drug use, which doesn't keep them safe. This is not to argue that women see themselves as victims or as having no power in that context. They're navigating that at a meso level because of gendered realities. I hope that makes sense. And then at a broader political level, we have risks where perhaps you're operating in an environment where there are no needle exchanges. Perhaps you're operating in an environment where you have a severe level of punishment around intravenous drug use. Fortunately, in New Zealand, and this is one positive shout out for drug policy here at the moment, we do have needle exchanges, which is fantastic. Weirdly, you can exchange needles as an intravenous drug user. That's okay. But if you've got methamphetamine use utensils, then you will be severely punished and possibly fined, even in prison, potentially. So there's a contradiction there. But that was Rhodes's theoretical lens. Okay, we've got all of these factors, things that are happening at a political, legal level, things that are happening at a social level, the social context, gender relations, environmental factors, family dynamics, and then what's happening at an individual level and intimate relationships between people. All of these factors affect how you make decisions about drug use. And really, by extension, how you make decisions about anything in your life. Probably you could apply this to anything. And so I applied that particular model to the stories that users had told me. And I could see the confluence of these variables and go, oh, okay, well, I see why you did what you did. That makes perfect sense to me. Hopefully that makes sense to you.
Thanks for watching PhD Unpacked. If you enjoyed that little snippet and you want to watch the whole interview and have access to a whole bunch of extra stuff surrounding the PhD Unpacked project, head over to Patreon and become a patron. Patreon.com/PhD Unpacked.